Maria lived a peaceful life in a small, sleepy village nestled between rolling hills. She wasn't one to seek attention. She was known for her love of gardening, spending most of her time among the flowers and vegetables she grew with her own hands. Her little house was cozy, filled with the scent of fresh herbs and blooming plants. The village was quiet, and so was Maria. She was a simple woman, content with the small joys that life offered her. However, in the eyes of the villagers, Maria was far too simple. They whispered among themselves, making judgments about her quiet nature, her plain clothes, and the fact that she never seemed to be involved in the gossip and events that stirred the rest of the town. She was often seen as someone who was out of place, different, and, to some, even boring. In a world where everyone seemed to have something loud to say, Maria's silence was the loudest of all. One evening, the village held its usual gathering at the local tavern. It was the highlight of the week for many, a place where people laughed, drank, and shared stories. Music played, and everyone danced to the lively tunes of the fiddler. The tavern was full, and the mood was high, but the laughter was often laced with the playful mockery that many of the villagers enjoyed so much. It wasn't meant to be cruel, at least not at first, but it always felt that way to some. On this particular evening, a group of young villagers, who were known for their teasing ways, noticed Maria sitting alone at a table by the window. They had never seen her laugh, never heard her sing, and this intrigued them. She had never been the center of attention, and they thought it was time to change that. "Maria," one of the young men called out, his voice carrying across the room. The others snickered, knowing what was coming. "Why don't you entertain us? We've never heard you sing, surely you can't be all that boring." Days passed, and Maria found herself adjusting to a new way of life. It was still the same village, the same streets, and the same familiar faces, but everything felt different now. People no longer whispered about her behind her back, and the teasing had stopped. Instead, the villagers treated her with kindness and respect. Her voice had opened a door that Maria hadn't even realized was there, and now, it felt as though the whole village was eager to see where it would take her. At first, Maria wasn't sure how to navigate this sudden attention. She had spent so many years living. Maria's life had changed in ways she had never imagined. She had gone from being the quiet woman who tended her garden in the background to becoming the heart and soul of her village, a woman whose voice had the power to captivate hearts and bring people together. It had started with a simple act, standing up to mockery and sharing her secret gift with others. But that single moment had led her to something far greater. Her performances had become a regular part of village life. Every week, the villagers gathered to hear her sing, and each time, Maria's voice left them mesmerized. The fear and anxiety she once felt before performing had faded. Now, when she stepped up to sing, she did so with confidence, knowing that her voice could reach and touch people in a way words never could. She had found something deep within herself, a strength she hadn't known was there. But it wasn't just the villagers who appreciated her voice. Invitations to perform in neighboring towns began to pour in, and before long, Maria was singing at larger events and festivals. She had become well known for her powerful, emotional performances, and people traveled from miles around just to hear her sing. Every time she stepped on stage, she gave her best, pouring her heart and soul into every note. However, with this growing fame came new challenges. The more attention she received, the more people began to expect from her. She couldn't just be the quiet woman in the village anymore. Now, she was a performer, and that came with its own pressures. Sometimes, Maria wondered if she was losing herself in all of it. She was still the same person, but the person she had been before seemed so far away. One evening, after a particularly exhausting performance, Maria walked back to her home feeling drained. It was late, and the cool night air was a welcome relief from the heat of the festival stage. The stars shone brightly above, and for a moment, Maria felt a sense of peace. But as she passed her garden, she felt a wave of longing. She missed the quiet moments she used to have, the ones where she could simply be herself, without anyone watching. The performances had become her new reality, but the simplicity of her old life still called to her. Maria walked into her house and sat down at the small table by the window, her fingers tracing the edge of the wooden surface. She had always loved this house, this little corner of the world where she could be alone with her thoughts. But even here, it felt different now. The walls seemed to echo with the noise of the crowds and the applause that had followed her everywhere. She missed the quiet moments of solitude, where she could sing for herself, not for anyone else. For the first time, Maria began to question whether this new life was truly what she wanted. Was she meant to perform in front of large crowds, or was there something else waiting for her? She had never asked for fame or attention, she had only wanted to sing because it brought her joy. But now, it seemed as though that joy was becoming harder to find. The next day, Maria decided to take a break from performing. She needed time to reflect, to remember who she was before all of this had started. She spent the day in her garden, digging her hands into the soil, planting new seeds, and letting the rhythm of the earth calm her mind. The sun was warm on her back, and the sound of birdsong filled the air. She had missed this, the simplicity of it all. As the days passed, Maria found herself reconnecting with the things that had brought her peace: her garden, her quiet moments, and her love of singing for herself. She realized that she didn't need the applause of strangers to feel fulfilled. She didn't need to perform in front of large crowds to prove her worth. What mattered was that she was singing because it made her happy, because it allowed her to express herself in a way nothing else could. One evening, as she sat on her porch, looking out at the sunset, Maria felt a sense of clarity. She had always believed that her voice was a gift to be shared with others, but she had also learned that it was a gift she could keep for herself. She didn't need to perform to make others happy, she just needed to sing when it felt right. It was the music that mattered, not the recognition that came with it. The next time the villagers asked her to perform, Maria politely declined. She explained that she needed to take some time for herself, to focus on her music in a way that was true to who she was. At first, they were disappointed, but they understood. They had come to respect Maria not just for her voice, but for the person she was. They admired her strength, her humility, and her ability to follow her heart. Maria's decision to step back from the spotlight wasn't an easy one, but it was the right one. She continued to sing, but only when it felt right, in the quiet of her home, in her garden, or in the stillness of the night. She had learned that the true beauty of her gift lay not in how many people heard it, but in how it made her feel. It was a part of her soul, a way for her to connect with the world around her, and she no longer needed the applause of others to validate it. In the years that followed, Maria became a quiet legend in her village. Her voice was still remembered, still spoken of with reverence, but it wasn't the fame that defined her. It was the way she had touched people's hearts and inspired them to find their own voices. She had shown them that true beauty doesn't come from the recognition of others, but from the act of creating something pure and meaningful. Maria never returned to the big stages or the crowded festivals. Instead, she found joy in the small moments, in singing for herself, in tending to her garden, and in the quiet relationships she had built with the people she loved. She had found peace, not in fame, but in the simplicity of being true to herself. As the years went by, Maria's name became a symbol of quiet strength and humility in the village. People would talk about the woman with the beautiful voice, the one who had stood up to mockery and transformed her life. But they would also speak of her grace, her wisdom, and the way she had taught them to live authentically. Maria had come a long way from the shy, quiet woman she had once been. She had learned that her voice was not just a gift for others, it was a gift for herself. And in that realization, she had found something even more powerful than fame: the ability to live a life that was true to who she was. And so, Maria lived out the rest of her days in the village, a woman who had once been mocked and overlooked, but who had found the courage to share her voice and, in doing so, had transformed not only her own life but the lives of those around her. She was no longer just the quiet woman with a hidden talent, she was a woman who had found her place in the world, not by seeking the applause of others, but by listening to her own heart. Quietly, staying out of the spotlight. Now, she was at its center, and it was both exhilarating and overwhelming. She often found herself looking out her window at the fields of flowers she had planted, remembering how simple life had been before. But that life was gone, and Maria couldn't deny the sense of fulfillment she felt every time she sang. There was something freeing about it, something that made her feel connected to the world in a way she hadn't known before. The village had begun to look at her differently, but it wasn't just the villagers who had changed. Maria had changed, too. She no longer felt like the quiet woman who tended to her garden in isolation. She had become someone important, someone whose voice could bring people together. And with this new sense of identity, she began to realize that she had a choice. She could either shrink back into the shadows or embrace the new opportunities that were opening up before her. One morning, a letter arrived at Maria's door. She wasn't used to receiving letters, and she was curious as she unfolded the paper. It was an invitation to perform at a festival in a nearby town. The festival was a celebration of music, and the organizers had heard of her singing. They wanted her to perform in front of a larger audience, one that would include people from several neighboring villages. Maria's heart skipped a beat. The thought of performing in front of strangers, people she didn't know, terrified her. She had never imagined her voice being heard by so many people. What if she made a mistake? What if they didn't like her singing? It was a huge step, and Maria was filled with doubt. But then she remembered the way the villagers had responded to her performance, how they had listened with admiration, not mockery. Maybe this was her chance to do something more with her talent, to take that step she had never dared to take before. For days, Maria wrestled with the decision. The festival was only a week away, and she knew she had to make up her mind. She spent long hours in her garden, thinking about the letter, her growing voice, and the possibilities that lay ahead. But no matter how hard she tried to push the thought away, the idea of performing in front of a larger crowd wouldn't leave her. One evening, as she sat alone by her window, watching the sun set over the hills, Maria made a decision. She would do it. She would go to the festival. It wasn't just about proving herself to others, it was about proving something to herself. She had spent so many years hiding her talent, afraid to let it shine. Now was her time to let it out and see where it could take her. The day of the festival arrived, and Maria felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that she couldn't turn back now. She packed a small bag with her best dress, something simple yet elegant, and set out toward the neighboring town. The journey was long, but the closer she got, the more her nerves began to settle. There was something invigorating about stepping into the unknown, about facing her fears head-on. When Maria arrived at the festival grounds, she was greeted by the festival organizers, who led her to a small stage at the edge of the event. The festival was bustling with people, laughter, music, and food, and the air was filled with excitement. Maria couldn't help but feel out of place among the crowds. She had never been to such a large event before. But as she looked around, she realized that it didn't matter how many people were there. What mattered was the music, and the music was hers to share. The organizers assured her that they had received glowing reviews about her singing, and she was about to perform in front of a crowd eager to hear her voice. Still, Maria felt a knot in her stomach. She couldn't shake the thought of standing in front of so many strangers, all with their eyes on her. But she had made the decision to do this, and now there was no turning back. As the moment approached, Maria stood backstage, taking deep breaths to calm her nerves. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade into the background as she focused on her breathing. She reminded herself that this was her chance to do something she had always dreamed of. She wasn't just singing for others, she was singing for herself, too. Finally, the moment arrived. The organizers signaled for her to take the stage. Maria stepped out into the spotlight, and for a brief moment, the crowd fell silent. She could feel the eyes of the audience on her, their anticipation hanging in the air. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt a sense of calm. She took a deep breath, smiled, and began to sing. The first few notes were shaky, but as she sang, Maria's confidence grew. Her voice, steady and strong, filled the air. The music wrapped around her like a familiar embrace, and the audience was captivated. She couldn't see their faces, but she could feel their attention, their energy. The more she sang, the more she forgot about the crowd and focused on the music. When she finished, there was a long moment of silence, and Maria's heart raced. Had they liked it? Had she done enough? But then, the applause came, and it was louder than she had ever imagined. The crowd cheered, clapped, and whistled in approval. Maria's heart soared. She had done it. She had faced her fear and come out the other side stronger. For the rest of the festival, Maria was treated like a star. People came up to her, congratulating her on her performance, telling her how moving her voice had been. It was a feeling she had never experienced before, and it filled her with a sense of pride and accomplishment. When she returned to the village, she was no longer the quiet woman who kept to herself. She was someone who had shared her gift with the world and had been embraced for it. The villagers treated her with even more respect, and her performances became a regular part of village life. But Maria had learned something that day at the festival. Her voice wasn't just a gift for her. It was something that could bring people together, something that could inspire others. Maria's life had changed forever. She no longer lived in the shadows, afraid to show who she really was. She had found her voice, and with it, she had found her place in the world. And as she stood in her garden, watching the flowers bloom, Maria knew that this was only the beginning. Her journey was far from over, and she couldn't wait to see where it would take her next. The room fell quiet for a moment, the challenge hanging in the air. It wasn't the first time someone had made a joke about Maria, but this time felt different. There was something in the way the young man had spoken, a mocking tone that stung just a little more. Maria, who had been quietly sipping her drink, lo, the moment Maria finished singing, there was an eerie silence in the tavern. Her voice had left an undeniable mark on the room, but no one knew how to respond. For a few long seconds, the air was thick with disbelief. The villagers, who moments ago had been laughing and mocking her, were now staring in shock, their mouths hanging open. Some shifted in their seats uncomfortably, unsure of what to do with the sudden change in the atmosphere. The following days were unlike anything Maria had ever experienced. The village, which had once felt so quiet and predictable, now felt alive with whispers of her performance. As she walked through the streets, she noticed how the villagers' eyes would follow her, but it wasn't with the same judgmental gaze she had grown used to. Instead, there was curiosity, admiration, and sometimes even awe. She had become someone different in their eyes, someone worthy of respect. Though the attention was still overwhelming, Maria couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Her voice had done what no words or actions had ever done before. It had changed how people saw her. No longer just the quiet gardener, she had become someone whose talent could captivate a room. And it wasn't just the young men who had mocked her that were impressed. The older women, who had never paid her much mind before, now looked at her with renewed respect. Some even came to her, asking when she would sing again, offering her kind words and compliments. One morning, as Maria worked in her garden, planting fresh herbs in neat rows, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned around to see Mrs. Arnold, one of the village's older women, walking toward her. Mrs. Arnold was a kind woman, known for her wisdom and gentle nature. She had always been friendly to Maria, though they had never been close. But today, there was something different in her eyes. Maria, Mrs. Arnold called softly, her voice warm, I wanted to speak with you. Maria wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward her, a bit surprised by the visit. Of course, Mrs. Arnold. What brings you here today? The older woman smiled, her eyes twinkling with kindness. I've heard so much about your singing, and I must say, I was quite moved by it. You have such a gift, Maria. It's rare to hear a voice like yours in this village. Maria felt her cheeks flush, the praise still feeling a little strange. She had never been one to seek compliments or attention. But something about Mrs. Arnold's words felt sincere. She smiled and said, Thank you, Mrs. Arnold. I never really thought much of it. It's just something I do when I'm alone, something that brings me peace. Mrs. Arnold's expression softened. That's the thing, my dear. A gift like yours isn't meant to be kept hidden away. You could touch so many hearts with your voice. Why don't you sing for us again? The village would love to hear it. Maria hesitated. The thought of singing in front of a crowd again made her nervous. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that kind of attention, especially now that the entire village seemed to be talking about her. But Mrs. Arnold's words stayed with her as the day passed. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe it was time to step out of the shadows and embrace her gift, to share it with others who would appreciate it. The next evening, the village gathered once more at the tavern. It was a tradition, a way for the villagers to unwind after a long week of hard work. The air was filled with laughter and chatter, but this time, there was an undercurrent of excitement. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, and Maria couldn't help but feel a twinge of nervousness in her chest. She hadn't agreed to sing yet, but she could feel the eyes of the village on her, as if they were expecting her to perform again. As the night wore on, Maria found herself sitting at a corner table, sipping her drink. She had been invited to join the others in the festivities, but she felt a little out of place. It wasn't that she didn't want to be a part of the celebrations, but she wasn't used to the attention. She had always been more comfortable on the edges of things, quietly observing rather than participating. Suddenly, the tavern keeper, Bill, approached her with a smile. Maria, he said, his voice friendly, we're all waiting for you. We heard you might sing again tonight. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't been expecting to be put on the spot like this. She had been trying to keep a low profile, hoping the villagers would forget about her impromptu performance. But it seemed that wasn't going to happen. Bill continued, Don't worry, Maria. It's not about impressing anyone. We just want to hear that beautiful voice of yours again. Maria looked around the room, seeing the hopeful faces of her fellow villagers. They weren't mocking her. They weren't expecting perfection. They were simply eager to hear her sing. For the first time, she realized that they were looking at her with respect, not with the cruel humor they had shown her before. The idea of sharing her gift with them didn't seem as terrifying as it once had. Taking a deep breath, Maria stood up from the table. Her hands were still a little shaky, but she walked toward the center of the room, her feet moving steadily. The room fell silent as she stood before them, waiting for her to sing. With one last look around the tavern, Maria closed her eyes. She thought about the peaceful moments she had spent singing alone, the joy it had brought her. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was just sharing something beautiful with the people who had once laughed at her, but who now valued her for who she was. Slowly, she began to sing. Her voice was softer this time, but just as powerful. The words flowed from her like a river, smooth and clear, filling the room with their warmth. As she sang, Maria felt the tension melt away. She wasn't worried about being perfect. She wasn't worried about how people might judge her. She was simply singing because it felt right. The villagers sat in stunned silence as they listened to her. It was a different kind of performance than the last one, more intimate and vulnerable. But it was just as beautiful, just as captivating. Maria's voice rose and fell with the melody, its power still unmistakable, but now it carried with it a sense of peace and grace. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment, and then the applause began. It was warm and genuine, a sound that Maria had never heard before, and it made her heart swell with pride. The villagers had accepted her, not for who they thought she should be, but for who she was. Maria smiled and bowed her head, feeling a sense of belonging that she had never experienced before. The applause continued, and she realized that she was no longer just the quiet woman in the background. She was part of the village, someone whose voice had brought something special to their lives. The night continued with laughter, dancing, and more music, but Maria's performance was the highlight of the evening. And as she sat back down with her drink, she knew that she had taken the first step toward embracing who she truly was, a woman with a gift that could inspire and move others. The village had changed that night, and so had Maria. She was no longer the woman who hid in the shadows. She was someone who had found her voice, and it had made all the difference. Maria stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never sung like that before, especially in front of such a crowd. She had always kept her talent hidden, as if it were a secret just for her. But now, in the face of their mockery, something had awakened inside her. She felt the music flow through her, and for the first time, she felt truly alive. Slowly, the first person in the tavern spoke. It was the tavern keeper, a stout man named Bill, who had been observing the entire scene. He pushed himself away from the counter, his eyes wide with surprise. He wasn't the type to hand out praise easily, but there was something about Maria's voice that even he couldn't ignore. "Maria," he said, his voice rough from years of drinking and shouting orders, that was beautiful." His words hung in the air, and one by one, the other villagers began to stir. The young man who had first called her out, still in shock, shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat and then muttered, "Well, I didn't expect that." Some of the others, who had joined in the teasing earlier, now looked at each other, avoiding eye contact. It was clear they didn't know how to react to the situation. Their playful mocking had quickly turned into a sense of embarrassment. The powerful, raw beauty of Maria's voice had caught them completely off guard. They hadn't expected her to stand up for herself in such a way. Maria felt a wave of warmth rush over her, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. The attention was still overwhelming, but it was different now. It wasn't the harsh, mocking attention she had felt earlier, it was the quiet awe of a crowd that had just witnessed something incredible. She took a slow, steady breath and sat back down at her table. She couldn't bring herself to look around at the people, though she could feel their eyes on her. Instead, she focused on the warmth of her cup in her hands, letting the simple act of holding it ground her. Her heart was still racing, and her palms were sweaty, but a part of her felt proud. She had stood up to their teasing, and in doing so, she had shown them a side of herself they had never known. As the moments passed, the initial shock in the room began to fade. Conversations started up again, though they were quieter and more subdued than before. People were still talking about Maria's performance, but the tone had changed. Instead of making fun of her, they were beginning to speak with admiration. The mockery had faded, replaced by something more respectful, more sincere. A group of women, who had been sitting near the back of the tavern, began to whisper among themselves. "I never knew she could sing like that," one of them said, her voice soft but full of wonder. "Her voice is beautiful. It's like nothing I've ever heard before." Maria could hear the whispers, and for the first time, she didn't feel the need to hide. She didn't feel small or insignificant. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of pride. These women, who had never paid her any attention before, were now looking at her with newfound respect. The young man who had mocked her earlier was now the first to apologize. He stood up from his seat, his face reddened with embarrassment. "Maria," he said, his voice quiet but sincere, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. I didn't know. I didn't know you could sing like that." Maria smiled gently, nodding at him. There was no need for words, not really. She could tell from his tone that he was genuinely remorseful, and that was enough for her. She had never been one to hold grudges, and the apology, though unexpected, felt good. It was a sign that things were changing, that the villagers were starting to see her in a different light. The rest of the evening passed in a much more relaxed atmosphere. The laughter had returned, but it wasn't the cruel, mocking laughter of before. This time, it was lighter, warmer, and more genuine. People talked about Maria's voice, asking her when she would sing again, praising her for the courage it took to stand up in front of everyone and perform. Maria, who had never sought the spotlight, found herself at the center of attention. She wasn't used to being the subject of admiration, but it felt good. It felt empowering. She realized that, perhaps for the first time, she wasn't just the quiet woman who kept to herself. She was someone with a unique gift, someone whose voice could move others, and she couldn't deny that she felt proud of that. As the evening wore on, some of the villagers asked if Maria would sing again the following week. There was talk of organizing a small performance for the entire village, something to celebrate the beauty of music and talent that so often went unnoticed. Maria, though unsure at first, felt a spark of excitement at the thought. Could she really do it? Could she stand in front of an entire crowd and sing again, knowing they would be expecting something special this time? She wasn't sure, but she was willing to try. It was a big step for her, and it would take a lot of courage, but Maria knew that she didn't want to go back to the way things had been before. She had something to offer, and for the first time, she felt ready to share it with the world. As she left the tavern later that evening, the cool night air felt refreshing against her skin. She walked home slowly, her thoughts racing. The village had changed in the span of a few hours. The people who had once laughed at her now looked at her with a sense of respect, admiration, and curiosity. Maria had been given a new kind of power, and she wasn't sure what to do with it just yet, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to hide it anymore. She wasn't going to let her talent go unnoticed again. The night was quiet as she walked back to her little house, the stars shining brightly above her. She could hear the faint sounds of laughter and music in the distance, but it didn't bother her. For the first time, she felt at peace with herself. The villagers may have forced her to sing, but in doing so, they had given her the chance to show them something incredible. And now, Maria knew she would never again be the same quiet, overlooked woman she had once been. Okayed up. She didn't want the attention. She didn't like the feeling of eyes on her, but there was no escape now. "Come on, Maria, we're waiting," another voice chimed in, a woman from the other side of the room. Maria hesitated. She had always kept to herself, never singing in front of others. As a child, she had loved singing in the fields, her voice rising and falling with the wind, but those moments had been her secret. They were hers alone, untouched by the judgment of others. Singing in front of these people, especially with the way they were staring at her, was not something she ever imagined. But the laughter grew louder, and soon it wasn't just the young group laughing. Others joined in, egging her on, teasing her further. "Are you afraid, Maria?" one of the men sneered, nudging his friend. "I didn't know the quiet girl was afraid of a little fun." The laughter was now thick in the air, and Maria's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her fingers trembling. She felt the weight of their eyes on her, each one waiting for her to crack, to make a fool of herself. She could feel the pressure building inside her chest, but she also felt something else: a sense of defiance, a desire to not be seen as the village joke any longer. With a deep breath, Maria stood up, her knees feeling unsteady beneath her. She didn't know what would happen next, but she couldn't back down. She couldn't let them win. She was no fool, and if they wanted to see something, she would show them. Her heart raced, and she walked slowly toward the center of the room, each step heavier than the last. As she reached the makeshift stage, the room fell even quieter, if only for a moment. Everyone had stopped talking, waiting to see what Maria would do. She stood there, her hands shaking, trying to keep her composure. Her eyes were downcast, her breath shallow, but deep within her, there was a fire that began to grow. She was no longer just the simple woman who had been picked on. She was someone who would show them, even if she had to make herself uncomfortable to do it. The tavern keeper, who had been watching from behind the counter, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He had heard of Maria's gardening skills, but no one had ever really paid much attention to her in any other way. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, wondering what would happen next. Maria stood motionless for a moment, then finally, with a small sigh, she closed her eyes. The voices of the villagers were a distant hum in her ears, and she focused on the one thing that had always comforted her: her voice. She had always been able to lose herself in the songs she sang, and now, that was what she would do. Taking a deep breath, Maria opened her mouth, and her voice filled the room. It was soft at first, almost tentative, but as she sang, it grew stronger. The words came effortlessly, and the melody seemed to rise from somewhere deep inside her. It wasn't the loud, forceful singing that many of the village women were known for, but it was pure and full of heart. There was something haunting about it, a beauty that the villagers hadn't expected. For a moment, the room was silent. The laughter had stopped. The mocking faces had turned into stunned expressions. No one knew what to say. Maria's voice filled every corner of the tavern, its rich, melodic tones wrapping around each person like a soft, warm blanket. The women stopped talking, the men stopped snickering, and all eyes were now on Maria, who was lost in her song, her head tilted slightly back as her voice soared. The room that had once been filled with mockery was now filled with awe. People leaned forward, their mouths slightly open, as if they were afraid they might miss something. Even the young men who had dared to call her out were frozen in place, their faces red with embarrassment. They had expected to see a timid, embarrassed woman stutter and falter, but instead, they were hearing a voice they would never forget. Maria's song echoed through the tavern, her voice reaching notes that seemed to carry far beyond the walls. It was as if the whole village could hear her now, and not just those in the tavern. The power of her voice was undeniable, and in that moment, Maria became more than just the quiet woman who tended to her garden. She became someone who could command attention with nothing but her voice.